greatest writer on death. A mind stocked with libraries of forsaken stories told and untold. Is gone. June 13th, 2023, aged 89. His death was another loss of one of those weighty souls that carried, with struggle and derision, the Western canon. Life is a memory, and then it is nothing. You might know him from the film adaptations of No Country for Old Men and The Road, but little is known of his early life and works, when he was an obscure writer sheltering in self-made shacks in the mountains of Texas. His life was largely mysterious. What he left for us to know can be glimpsed in the visions of his brutal prose. His bibliography trails a life project of a man obsessed with the most ceaseless questions. I will explain to you fundamental features of McCarthy's life and ideas which I've yet to encounter in one video. Keep in mind the 6 primary themes which drive his stories: loss and death, memory and dreams, mystery and faith. Cormac, or as he was legally known, Charles, was born in Providence, Rhode Island, to an Irish Catholic family. His father was a lawyer and his mother a secretary. In truth, the young Charles McCarthy lived an externally disillusioned life. School was pointless, and the mechanics of the social world a passed-down game played by those that continued it without question. He couldn't care less. But his inner life was rich, varied, and curious, a world of its own. I was the only one with any hobbies, and I had every hobby there was. Name anything, no matter how esoteric. I could have given everyone a hobby and still had 40 or 50 to take home. At 18, he attended the University of Texas. He studied liberal arts, but found his interests crawling into various subjects. With no direction and no desire of a degree, still a relentless outcast, he joined the U.S. Air Force in 1953. In 4 years of service, whatever machinations of fate or chance had finalized an insular and misfit past life now configured a Judas hole into the writer he would become. In the Army, he read seriously and voraciously as he never did before. The young McCarthy never cared for literature. By his own accounts, he wasn't a reader. We can only guess the interior of that chamber of his mind where this potential had hid, malnourished and hungry. I don't know why I started writing. I don't know why anybody does it. Maybe they're bored or failures at something else. William James, a 19th century psychologist, once claimed a singular transformative period as seen, for example, in intense religious conversions can be secretly laboring in the unconscious for years, only waiting for an outside stimulus to draw it out. The unconscious is a passion for McCarthy, specifically in the retelling and symbolic significance of dreams, a recurrent theme in his books, which in a way were confessions of what mystery he had encountered, of what terror, inconsolable, and bottomlessly evil the world he contemplated was. McCarthy returned to university in 1957 with a new and unending passion. He wrote 2 short stories for a student magazine, Wake for Susan and A Drowning Incident. Both led him to winning the Ingram Merrill Award. Then, shortly after, he dropped out of university, and, in similar fashion to his young characters who abandoned their childhood homes, he headed for Chicago. He began drafting multiple novels, never sticking to just one at a time. He set his pen name to Cormac McCarthy, possibly as a reference to an Irish chieftain from the 15th century. Then, without an agent or any real concern for the conventions of the publishing industry, he submitted the manuscript to his first novel, The Orchard Keeper, to Albert Erskine of Random House. Random House was unsure of Erskine's decision to publish the novel. It was violent, obscure, and dark. But Erskine recognized the heavy influence of Faulkner. He understood that the Southern Gothic genre carved out a sizable market in literary fiction. And simply, McCarthy's writing was brilliant. The novel was later published in 1965. It was a commercial failure. McCarthy would be unrecognized, misunderstood, underappreciated, at times homeless, resolutely destitute and alone, all by his own decision, for 27 years. During that time, the profit he made was mainly from grants. Saul Bellow and other prominent writers begged the MacArthur Foundation to consider him for a fellowship, which later funded his research-focused travels through America's Southwest to write his 1981 masterpiece, Blood Meridian, another commercial failure. In 1993, All the Pretty Horses was brought to the public. The light had finally been cast. He won the National Book Award. Millions of eyes wheeled across his pages, the morbid and degenerate nobility of his characters, their God-forsaken insights. In his old age, he finally welcomed the world into his own. I use the word welcome specifically, for Cormac could have easily been a giant of literature early on. But he chose a life of reclusion and poverty, and writing fiction inaccessible to even fiction readers. He showed no care for writing conventions, even foregoing punctuation. Character development and plot were distractions to the ultimate project. To read a book is to converse with the mind that wrote it. McCarthy speaks to us about a world with many heads and fangs. It is feral, dark, and bloody. It is not within our power to know its nature. The substance of memory, whatever it be, is our consultation to its slippage from our grip. And so the terminus of a voyage once sought, so headlong did these billions of souls ferry into the vastness of a void. Yet, there's also a beating vein of beauty in McCarthy's world, which can be hard to see, for the monstrous network in where it's embedded is of a matter entirely unlike it. But it is this matter which gives it the contrast needed to be perceived. The later McCarthy tapped into this vein, enlarged it, and finally surrendered his later stage books to be defined by it. Like Nietzsche, you can tell that McCarthy believed that beauty was what could justify the world. Beauty in nature, in the simplest acts of kindness, in music, in mathematics, and in prose. McCarthy was a category of writer best termed as a craftsman. Hemingway, another craftsman, was an influence in McCarthy's later work, with the heavy use of declaratives and simple yet poignant descriptions. Where McCarthy succeeded beyond Hemingway was in the crafting of analogies, his trademark figure of speech. McCarthy's analogies are inspired by medieval literature. That's why so much of his vocabulary is esoteric. Where Hemingway and McCarthy differed was how explicit they were on the writing process. When asked about how he writes, McCarthy had given us a parable. There was a guy who was a great wing shot on a quail hunt in Georgia. He killed everything he saw. He dropped them all morning. One of the other guys said, "You're the best wing shot I've ever seen." At lunch, the guy asked him, "Do you shoot with one eye open or both?" He paused and thought about it. Finally, he said, "I don't know." In his first public interview on the Oprah Winfrey Show, McCarthy went further to say that writing is about trusting in that unknown source from where creativity comes from. It is an unconscious process, a kind of worship and subsequent reaping from an unknowable power. Why McCarthy chose to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show out of all the intellectually stimulating interviews he could have chosen is fascinating. Even while extremely poor, He had been offered thousands to discuss his most philosophical books, all to turn it down. So why Oprah Winfrey? To find the answer, you must know what McCarthy generally thought about the arts and literature, and why he was always far more interested in engaging with science and experts in physics or biology. McCarthy cherished simplicity and certainty. This may at first be surprising, but it's obvious when listening to his most recent interviews within the Santa Fe Institute, a center studying complexity theory in various disciplines, which he routinely visited to attend lectures, work on his novels, and discuss theory. He was incredibly down-to-earth and humble with what he knew, which was a lot, since he was a polymath. He did not care to romanticize or prescribe some otherworldly wisdom to people, or to enter into the arena of interpretive debates within academic literature. One has a personal connection with a book. A public discussion of its meaning is to divulge the most important meaning it has, your meaning. Most importantly, it locks an interpretation within the rusty rigidity of a workplace tradition, the tradition of academia or the media, thereby sterilizing it of the mystery which gives it life. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze once said that the most important stories have a mythic quality. Their plots are not concluded, rather continuing in new ways through the people that read them. That quality can only be sustained by a mystery, which is what grants the story the potential to be timeless. Timelessness allows a story to be spread and passed on, generation by generation. A finalized meaning kills the capacity for mutations of that meaning. It could have no relevance for a people in another time and place, since these things are in the flux of change. McCarthy's books are sufficient enough to be their own meaning. One moves on after the page is turned. There's no further discussion, just further readings. McCarthy had even said that what he finished writing was no longer his concern. That's why he chose Oprah, who would not pester him with open-ended and unanswerable questions. She asked mostly basic life questions, practical and answerable. That's the domain he liked to discuss. All the rest was the labor of the unconscious. With all that being said, next I will talk about two of McCarthy's novels, not to tell you about their meanings, but as a means to give insight on McCarthy's character, the ideas that interested him most, and his most important virtue that centered his creations. The first is Suttree, the only one to bear some witness to McCarthy's personal life. It's half autobiographical and took 20 years of drafting, published in 1979.
What do you believe? I believe that the last and the first suffer equally, pari passu. Equally? It is not alone in the dark of death that all souls are one soul. Of what would you repent? Nothing. Nothing? One thing. I spoke with bitterness about my life, and I said that I would take my own part against the slander of oblivion, and against the monstrous facelessness of it, and that I would stand a stone in the very void where all would read my name. Of that vanity I recant all.
Suttree is about a man named Cornelius Suttree. He's a loner, a graduate, the son of a lawyer. By all accounts, his upbringing was privileged, but his family life, though never fully revealed, is hinted as troubled by internal conflict and resentment. Suttree, by his own choosing, has fallen into the world of the damned. He has forgone the world in which he was raised, the normal and functional, and he chose a journey of street adventures and misadventures with his choice selection of friends, who resemble in some way those McCarthy personally knew. A subplot is also developed out of a character named Harrogate, who we first encounter in a melon patch with his pants down, sweating and heaving with a member of the Gord family.
Somebody has been my watermelons.
Why did Suttree seemingly devote himself to poverty and befriend those of different standing to him? What project, if any, was he working on? I want to prime you with a quote by Joseph Conrad. Let him mature the strength of his imagination among the things of this earth. This relates to McCarthy's motives to personally indulge himself in the streets, the things of this earth, to nourish his imagination through the friendships of the varied he cultivated, to see a perspective the majority could never see. McCarthy had curiosity for nearly everything under this sun. A novelist who would think himself of a superior essence to other men would miss the first condition of his calling. Of him from whose armory of phrases 1 in 100,000 may perhaps hit the far distant and elusive mark of art, I would ask that in his dealings with mankind he should be capable of giving a tender recognition to their obscure virtues. Suttree, like McCarthy, enjoyed the company of those downtrodden and of disrepute, seeing within them the most interesting and redemptive qualities. I want even for the worst of the characters, some slinking nobility. McCarthy did not care to surround himself with writers except a select few, like Edward Abbey, who were on the fringes of literature due to not following popular conventions and subject matter. If you read Abbey's remarkable novel, Desert Solitaire, you'll glimpse into the mind of another reclusive loner who's found solace in the deserts of southeast Utah. Abbey makes numerous references to bygone poets and writers, all within the Western canon, the anthology where the trauma of selfhood first developed in literature. The true use of Shakespeare or of Cervantes, of Homer or of Dante, of Chaucer or of Rabelais, is to augment one's own growing inner self. The mind's dialogue with itself is not primarily a social reality. All that the Western canon can bring one is the proper use of one's own solitude, that solitude whose final form is one's confrontation with one's own mortality. Literature that did not exchange hands with the fate that seals us was no interest to McCarthy. He needed a literature that could reconcile the final conclusion, not to provide comfort or respite, but to intensify the beauty of life, its rapturous voice, through the juxtaposition of its silencing. The outsiders of society had directly confronted the trials of life's most sorrowful episodes. Their suffering was the alchemy that stirred McCarthy's creativity. Their triumphs, though insignificant to the masses, was the light source that blinked hope in the darkness of McCarthy's novels. Now consider a dialogue by Suttree.
In my father's last letter, he said that the world is run by those willing to take the responsibility for the running of it. If it is life that you feel you are missing, I can tell you where to find it. In the law courts, in business, in government. There's nothing occurring in the streets, nothing but a dumb show composed of the helpless and the impotent.
This surely would be the voice of McCarthy's own father, who was disappointed by his son's apparent failings in a potential career. His father stood as an exemplar for the salaried and domesticated man, the things that McCarthy never wished to be. McCarthy was notorious for dodging employment. In that interview with Oprah, he said, "I always knew I didn't want to work. It was my number one priority. You're just here once. Life is brief, and to have to spend every day of it doing what somebody else wants you to do is not the way to live it." Cornelius Suttree, though competent and educated, chooses not to work. He lives on what he catches and through the generosity of his friends. At times he gets arrested for vagrancy or drunk fighting. He seems haunted by a vaguely told past and the death of his stillborn brother. We also discover that Suttree had a wife. They had a baby whose death Suttree would feel tremendous guilt over. He goes to the cemetery alone and breaks down at the grave. Then he gets a ride to the in-laws' house, sees his crying wife, and gets threatened and driven out by her parents. Soon after, Suttree heads to the Smoky Mountains, where he loses his grounding to the real world, risks starvation, and accidentally consumes psychedelic mushrooms. After this trial, he returns into the city. He is renewed. His breakdown has become a far-gone memory and no longer a part of him. The redemptive quality of nature is not new with McCarthy. Many writers, like Hemingway, have written of lonesome journeys into the wilderness. Characters abandon their present lives to head into a nature wherein seems to lurk something that they have lost. It's like society had robbed them of what was integral, and they must go to cultivate their solitude in an environment not tainted by people. What could someone lose? Meaning, purpose, perspective? I believe that what Suttree had lost was faith. I don't mean faith in the religious sense, not specifically. Now, God is always mentioned in McCarthy's novels, but more so in the context of wrestling with God. God is like this entity that stalks his characters, a moon-sized predator, always tantalizing them with answers to their impossible questions. When asked about his religious faith, McCarthy does not give a conclusive answer, but we know he was raised Catholic. We know religion had a significance in his life. At times he believed, and at times he didn't. Like his characters, he wrestled with his faith. Now, when I say Suttree had lost faith, I mean the faith of his entire project, of leaving behind his comfortable home, his wife and child, his prospects, and any semblance of a functioning life. What before made that project dimensional and robust had now flattened from the weight of his son's death. The world's hard message that his faith was an idiosyncratic perversion, a personal and critical error of judgment. It seemed the world was telling him that he made a mistake. To make a decision, one requires faith that whatever intent and goal that predicates the decision will fruition accordingly. Faith is required because we do not have complete knowledge. We cannot see the story of the future until we live it. This present needs to be viewed in hindsight, to sense the meaning that's always been there, to understand the mechanics of faith that operates our lives. We hope the future will be brighter than the now, but the path is uncertain. The variables of both success and failure are innumerable. There is danger wherever we turn. Reward is never guaranteed, and at times, not what we want. McCarthy needed faith when he dropped out of university and headed to Chicago to draft novels and become a writer. He needed faith when he was kicked out of a hostel into the streets of New Orleans for not being able to pay a $40 monthly fee. He needed faith in his abilities as a writer, not only to write what he did, but to also have it shared with an audience that could recognize its value. Let's put it another way. Suttree needed faith to find meaning again in his lifestyle. The father needed faith when he journeyed with his young son through the nuked terrains of the road. Boyd, in The Crossing, needed faith when he rode alone through the violent American West. John Grady Cole needed faith when he went back to Mexico for the girl he loved.
What do you think is the one indispensable gift? Faith.
This is the modus operandi of all of McCarthy's novels. It is his most important virtue. To lose faith is to lose everything. This response you're seeing is given by the suicidal Alicia Western in McCarthy's recent book, Stella Maris, told purely through dialogue between patient and therapist. The novel is a confession for McCarthy's ideas, his last attempt at communicating what obsessed him. Alicia is in a way an alter McCarthy. She couldn't care less about ordinary affairs and is concerned only with the most profound problems, which for her have no solution. Simply, she's lost faith, a reason for her suicidal ideation. Her loss started at a very young age. She was a child prodigy. A word, as Alicia mentions, stems from the Latin word for monster. She pursued mathematics as a way to understand fundamental reality, but when the discipline ventured beyond the constraints of the physical world, it ceased to be coherent. So, she began studying other subjects and found them still limited and struggling with an inherent unknown. Her solace was music. the one thing that seemed pure and free from the stain of human inquiry. The philosopher Schopenhauer once said that if all in existence ended, music would be the only thing remaining. Alicia's fascination throughout the novel is the unconscious and the way it speaks to us through dreams. She posits that the unconscious understands mathematics far more than we do. The only article McCarthy had ever written, called the Kekule problem, referencing Auguste Kekule's discovery of the ring shape of the benzene molecule from a dream he had, is reworked in Alicia's dialogue. McCarthy had claimed that the unconscious does not communicate to you with language, because language is a relatively new technology that during evolution spread throughout the species like a parasitic invasion. The unconscious prefers to talk to us through dreams. In McCarthy's novels, dreams seem to be fragments of ancient and primitive times, maybe visions of what's to come. At times they are fantastical and folksy, such as the opening dream of The Road, where some creature stalks a lake. In folklore, lakes are usually populated by monsters, and in Celtic mythology, they're portals to another world. In The Crossing, McCarthy's most dreamlike and biblical novel, the character Boyd, like another character, the Kid, from Blood Meridian, without warning embarks on a hero journey through the American West. He is confronted by demonic figures and unrelenting violence. The landscape seems to gradually shift into a dreamscape, and what is actual is not salvageable from what is imagined. Boyd dreams of a dry lake wherein people burn like trees. A dry lake may symbolize that whatever portal that had existed is gone, therefore a permanent loss with something sacred. Then another dream of his father lost in the darkness of a desert, possibly a call to action for him to rescue his father, or the archetype of what his father represents, the old world patriarch bred undying values and traditions. The world that existed before can never be replicated. It is swallowed by the world of the present, which itself will be swallowed by the world of the future. The chain which links these worlds to give them a semblance of history and our place within it is memory, which is plotted on the architecture of our ancient unconscious mind, that same ground from where every night plays the theater of humanity. These ideas and their variations fill hundreds of McCarthy's pages. They are described concretely when his characters look at family photo albums. They look on at these frozen faces of dead forebears with sadness, longing, and a muted respect. Alicia has a recurring dream. She sees a village. Women are tending to their children, washing clothes. In them is the instinctual knowing that their past and present will be shorn from the world. For on the hills skirting their village there are strange men dressed in flayed skins, their feral eyes searching, their hands heavy with blood and axes. The men in the village come out of their huts with rage. They will fall apart, first with axes, then from memory, forever.
Sometimes the unconscious will keep working on certain dreams, revising them, hoping you'll get it. The interesting part is that it knows you haven't gotten it. For historical reasons, it's loath to speak to you. It prefers drama, metaphor, pictures, but it understands you very well, and it has no other cause save yours.
Besides discussions of the unconscious, McCarthy mentions the theories of many mathematicians, such as Gödel, Frege, and Grothendieck. Discussing their theories is beyond the scope of this video, but every one of them wrestled with the age-old dilemmas and contradictions of mathematics. They could not find answers, and many were disillusioned. From the long passages of theory in the novel, it seems the takeaway is that there's the actual thing that people are doing, such as physics, and then there's the ideas of what they're doing. Example, discovering fundamental reality. These things are not perfectly equal. If you do a meta-analysis, which is what the philosophy of science attempts to do, you'll find inconsistencies. Now there is one person McCarthy mentions who Alicia considers a contemporary to herself, which I find the most interesting and insightful. That person is the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is actually very important. From the most recent interviews, I've discovered that McCarthy had a deep respect for Wittgenstein and his ideas, and I believe Alicia is even modeled after him. They both follow similar life stories, both obsessed by mathematics, then disillusioned, losing all faith, and suicidal. Wittgenstein changed the direction of 20th century philosophy. His contributions questioned the way we ask philosophical questions, and whether we are asking the right questions. McCarthy most importantly admired Wittgenstein's moral character and the type of philosopher he was, which was a kind of atavism to the ancient Greeks. Wittgenstein came from one of the wealthiest families in Europe, but he renounced his inheritance and gave it to starving artists and his siblings. After serving in World War I, he later worked as a gardener and village school teacher. Throughout his life, he had a respect for Christianity, not really believing in a God, but understanding the importance of a religious life. Wittgenstein worked on logic and analytical philosophy, but McCarthy had explained in an interview at the Santa Fe Institute that Wittgenstein was truly concerned with moral questions of right and wrong, of how one should live in the face of life's suffering. McCarthy had said he doesn't know what point philosophy has if it's not informing you on how life should be lived, which is something that he sought within literature, the real purpose of literature, of which he could hardly find from many so-called philosophers. If you look at classical literature, the core of literature is tragedy. You don't really learn much from the good things that happen to you. Tragedy is at the core of human experience. That's what makes life difficult, and that's what we want to know about. We want to know how to deal with it. It's unavoidable. There's nothing you can do to forestall it. So how do you deal with it? For sure, McCarthy's world is bleak, but it is not without redemption. It has a respect for the grandeur of loss and beauty, an appreciation for the smallest things that are certain, stable in the chaos. A hot cup of coffee, a filling meal, a "how are you doing" from an old friend, and another "I'm all right." How many times have you read a diner scene in McCarthy's novels? Why does he give so much emphasis and repetition to the most primitive sensory moments? Those small talk conversations that seem to not push the story forward or give any meaning. I've asked myself these questions, and I've come to the answer that these aren't filler episodes. There are moments of gratitude. In a complicated world fattened on tragedy and war and suffering, the possession of the simplest, most pure joys is a transcendence. McCarthy told us to be grateful for the smallest gifts. Things can get a lot worse. In a later interview on NPR, an interviewer asked, "Cormac, when you hang around scientists, do they make you pessimistic or optimistic?" "I'm pessimistic about a lot of things, but there's no reason to be miserable about it." Cormac McCarthy was an example for the faith that drove his characters, the faith that made him a curious and passionate man, that allowed him to continue the most weighty dialogues with himself and others. His tremendous body of work is a testament to that. What are your thoughts on the ideas in this video? Do you have anything to add or refine? Let's keep the dialogue going with Cormac McCarthy, the last great writer of Western literature.
The desert he rode was red, and red the dust he raised, the small dust that powdered the legs of the horse he rode, the horse he led. In the evening a wind came up and reddened all the sky before him. There were few cattle in that country because it was barren country indeed, yet he came at evening upon a solitary bull rolling in the dust against the blood-red sunset like an animal in sacrificial torment. The blood-red dust blew down out of the sun. He touched the horse with his heels and rode on. He rode with the sun coppering his face and the red wind blowing out of the west across the evening land, and the small desert birds flew chittering among the dry bracken, and rider and horse passed on, and their long shadows passed in tandem like the shadow of a single being, passed and paled into the darkening land, the world to come.